Państwa ponownie w
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, in our third official part of our Congress, and the last official part. We're going to watch a street thriller now. Of course, I'm not talking about the presentation that is going to be shown, but the topic itself. It's about the dark net, and which wants to get to our money, the money that you manage. Sometimes they are effective in it, and we are going to talk about it in a minute. This is a phenomenon that is widely spread right now, and it will generate huge costs. Well, actually, the attempts to avoid it will be very cost-consuming. Peter Van Tienen, Director of Business Development Fraud and ID EMEA Experian. The floor is yours, Peter.
Good afternoon. So, hello everyone. I'm going to have to do this in English, I'm really sorry. So my name is Peter Van Tienen, I work for Experian, Fraud and Identity. Let me first take the opportunity to thank BIK to invite me back this year to say something. Although, Marius, I must say, last year I got 30 minutes of speaking time, and this year I've got 15. So I hope that doesn't tell you anything about the quality of my speech. So I'll try to make it really short. So today I want to speak to you about solving for account takeover and risk-based authentication. So very briefly, and I'm going to keep the tempo quite high, we're going to speak about what is account takeover fraud, why is it such a challenge these days. We're going to look at some methodologies, something we call the identity jigsaw, which is a technique that fraudsters use to copy our identities. We're going to look at how it actually works, and then risk-based authentication as the way forward. Right, so let's dive into it. What is it? Well, there are a few definitions, but the one that I like is this one. It says third-party fraudsters progressively acquire customer data to take over existing customer accounts. Now, there's two words, if you ask me, that are most important words on the definition. First of all, it's third-party fraudsters. It means professional organizations, highly skilled and motivated people, usually abroad, to make sure that they're not being convicted by law enforcement. Because if there's, for example, 6 Chinese people sitting in a region somewhere in China attacking a Polish bank, then chances are about 0% that they're going to get caught by law enforcement. But the second group of third-party fraudsters these days is also young people. It could be one of your children or my children, 15-year-old kid with a laptop sitting upstairs on his bed. Mom and dad have no idea what he's doing, and he's using stolen software that he bought on the dark web, the illegal internet, which is, by the way, a lot easier than a lot of people think. And I'll get back in this example in a minute. Second word is progressively. So account takeover is not a steal something and run away. It's a process. It's a well thought out process, and we're going to speak about that. It's manipulating customer records to enable them to fraudulently acquire, obviously, goods or services. That's what it is. So why is this such a challenge? Well, the obvious reason is that money's being stolen, which is always a challenge. But specifically, account takeover is a challenge because it provides a bigger payoff for the fraudsters. So they target high-value accounts. Now, if I were a fraudster and I would take over an account, I would prefer an account with a lot of money in it, or a lot of points, like frequent flyer miles, or a lot of credit, or what have you. And this means it's a bigger problem for the consumer. It's a bigger problem for companies such as yourself, and not only in monetary results, but also in brand image, for example, or people that go somewhere else. Now, I know this is different in the banking sector than in most any other sector. So if I buy shoes online and I don't like it, I don't like my customer experience, or something has been stolen from me, I easily switch to another e-commerce website where they also sell shoes. In the banking sector, people are more likely to stay, but I think that's going to change over the next 3 to 5 years, that consumers will also change from banks or financial institutions more quickly than they do today. So that's a real challenge. So let's talk about this identity jigsaw. It's a term that you see a lot on the internet currently. You can see it here. We'll progressively assemble the victim's identity jigsaw, which is basically a methodology to copy someone's identity. Let's go briefly in it. It always starts with data breaches. Now, we all can read about this. There's more and more data being stolen. Some numbers say that there's more data being stolen than that there are people on the planet Earth, which also means that we can assume that all of our data one day has been stolen already. For example, if you would have a LinkedIn account, chances are that someone stole your login details and your password through one of these data breaches. Now, a fraudster could have, for example, your email or your username this way. We, as consumers, we're not helping as well, to be fair, because did you know that on an average that we have 26 online accounts as we sit here on average as Europeans, and we have only 5 passwords to protect those accounts, which is very, very poor. So if I were a fraudster and I have your LinkedIn login name and your password, I could actually try the same combination on different websites, right? I don't even have to do that manually. There's techniques for that. One of those is called swamping, as you can see here. It's mass testing of accounts. And the most well-known example was Tesco Bank over in the UK, where we saw irregularities on 40,000 accounts, and out of 9,000 accounts, actually money was being stolen. So that tells you something about the ratio, 9,000 out of 40,000. And by the way, this was a 15-year-old kid doing it from his bedroom with a laptop on his lap, and his parent has no clues what was happening. So this is the reality of today. Right, so swamping gets more information, gets more puzzles to that jigsaw. For example, account details. But what about this one? SS7 hack, you see here. Now, the SS7 is an old network, an old protocol, which was written in the 90s, which is basically for telecom operators, for telcos, to communicate to each other for billing purposes and roaming purposes. But wherever there is 2 networks that speak to each other, there's always a little bit of space in the middle for fraudsters to attack. So the SS7 attacks are still very, very lively today, and this is actually one of the reasons that WhatsApp, the WhatsApp service, switched to a more safe environment a while ago, because with SS7 hacks, fraudsters can actually read or redirect messages, and they can listen into calls. Why do we want to do that? Not because they're curious, but they want to obtain the one-time password authentication. So with that on top, you can see they have the jigsaw completed. So let me take one step back and refer to this in the offline world, because it usually clarifies things a lot. So this is a burglar, right? And we know how this guy works. We know he comes in the middle of the night. We know which tools he uses. We know his method of operation. And so we also know how to protect ourselves from this guy, right? We need bigger doors, we need locks, we need alarm systems, alarm bells, etc., etc. So the question is, what if this burglar now all of a sudden becomes smart? I'll give you an example. Your television is broke. You call the cable company to say that your television doesn't work, and 30 minutes later, this guy shows up, right? The cable guy. And he says, "Good afternoon, I understand you have a problem with your cable. What are you going to do? You're going to let him in." Why? Because you expect him, and he identifies himself the way you would expect him to identify himself. So you're going to let him in. Same thing is happening online at this moment. This guy used to be our attacker like 10 or 20 years ago, from a basement, attacking our systems, so we know how to protect ourselves through firewalls and extra securities and alarm bells. But when this guy becomes this guy, and he identifies himself the way you would expect him, then we're going to let him in. And this is what's happening in the online world. In other words, the way you are attacked has been changed, and also the way you need to protect yourself would need to change as well. So that's one of the key messages from me here today. Now, obviously, there are a lot of ways in which financial institutions or other companies protect themselves already, right? Some are good, some are not so good, some are really strong. But the question is not only how are you able to protect yourself from fraudsters, but how are you going to keep the balance with that customer experience, because that's the key question today. Now, as I said earlier, in other sectors, consumers tend to switch immediately to somewhere else. And I'm really curious to hear your views later in the panel discussion on how you think that's going to develop in the banking world, because I think that's going to change as well. So yes, there are methods to keep the bad guys out, but again, the key question is, how do we find a balanced approach? So how do we deliver, frictionless customer experience, whilst at the same time keeping the fraudsters out? And that balanced approach for me is always about customer experience, but also about operational expenses. Because you can manually review all applications, and that will bring definitely your fraud costs down, but that will bring your operational expenses up. And manually reviewing a lot of applications will also bring your customer experience down, because it takes a lot of time. So it's always a question, how do we balance out all three? Right. So if we look at that, a balanced approach to fraud, there's a couple of elements that I wanted to run past you. Obviously, you need to keep up with the rapidly evolving threats of the increasing fraud developments. Now, this is something to keep in mind, because fraudsters don't have, unlike banks, they don't have timelines, they don't have committees that need to approve budgets and stuff like that. So they can be a lot more agile than you can, than we all can. And that's quite scary. So we need to build infrastructures and processes that detect and process all fraudulent logins, but here it comes, with not impacting too much all the customers. And that's the challenge of today. So one of the ways of doing that is building a layered approach. And you'll hear and can read a lot about layered approach, multi-layered approach at this moment. So it means that we need to look beyond the data that we know into other areas as well. Now, for those of you who were here last year, I spoke a little bit about, for example, device recognition, looking into the device that's actually being used in order to do a login or create a new account or whatever that might be. And that's clearly one of the ways to look further than the data that we have. It says here what device are we using, but we can look much further than that. Things like biometrics or behavioral biometrics, which is kind of a cool new technology, which doesn't look at biometrics, so it doesn't look at your thumb or your eye, but it actually looks at the way you're using, for example, your keyboard or your mouse, etc., the way you type. It's all new layered, all new layers add to the data that we already know to make sure that we can authenticate whoever that is on the other line of the computer, but at the same time don't frustrate the customers of coming in. All of this to do basically this, risk-based authentication. In the interest of time, I'll keep this very short, and it's very simple, but this is where the market, in our view, is definitely going. Can we authenticate you based on your risk? In other words, let's not treat every customer that's logged in the same way, like send them all a text message or do all some kind of other authentication message. But let's look at what's going on. So if we recognize the customer and the risk is very low, well, clearly we can just let him in. If we don't recognize him and the risk is high, do we want to send him a one-time password or maybe even a stronger authentication? And those are the two extremes. That's quite easy. Question is, what are you doing in the middle? And this is where this layered approach come in. So curious to hear your thoughts on that as well. So to wrap it up, this is what such an attack looks like. And we spoke about pretty much all of this during this presentation. So first of all, let me stress that it's a combination of online and offline. So fraudsters will attack you from all channels. And if we talk about account takeover fraud, they will be in every step of the way. So in this example, someone or a computer installs malware on someone's computer. Clearly, that's an online action. And through social engineering, the fraudster can obtain missing details. Could be by calling or by emailing or whatever that might be, phishing attacks, etc. Then they log into the account, they have a look around, they see, for example, when the money comes in or the salary is being paid, is there a Christmas bonus to be expected, of all these kind of things. So that's what we call the observe stage. And then they can add new target accounts, for example, by social engineering or using the SS7 hack, which I just described in the beginning, and then obtain the security codes, you know, through SIM swap and all these kind of technologies. And then all the way in the end, it says initiate transfer. Now, a truly layered approach is necessary here, because if you just focus on one of these elements, in our view, you'll be too late. For example, if you just monitor your transactions, it would be the equivalent of locking the back door. And clearly what we need to do here is observing the whole house. That's why it says multiple monitoring points enable fraud to be caught before it is committed. So this is something that we look at with our clients, these multiple monitoring points, as you can see right here. Right, I'm going to finish off with some takeaways before we open the discussion. And actually, my overall key takeaway on all these takeaways is that I would like to consider you to accept these. For true. Can you go one slide back, please? Thank you. So number one, it says customer data is out there and criminals are able to make this identity jigsaw complete. And I would just advise you to take this for granted, take this as a fact, because all the information is out there. Second thing, account takeover fraud will grow, and it will only be contained, in our view, with this layered approach. So I would never say that we, from Experian, or one other company, would have all the solutions under one roof. That's not how this works. You need to have a layered approach with different solutions tied together. Third one, it says risks are not only monetary. So we spoke about this briefly. Brand image. In some countries, it's mandatory to go public if you had any fraud done in your organization, in your bank. And in some countries, it isn't. I think one day, with European legislation, it will be mandatory for everyone. And then, you know, the world will change. Number 4, it says, fraudsters attack multiple lines of business across channels simultaneously. This is more a key takeaway in terms of your internal organization. So we would advise you to speak with everyone, not only the people from online or digital, but then the people from the call center, people from marketing, sit down together and make a fraud strategy which entails all these lines of business. Number 5, it says covert surveillance across the customer journey enables activity to be intercepted before the crime is committed. Obviously, this would be our goal. There's fraud detection, which is really good, but we really want to be in the business of fraud prevention. And this is the way to do that. And the last one, moving beyond the data alone will reveal more fraud and will uncover previously unknown fraud rings. So we think this is the way to go. So thank you very much. I hope I stick within my time.
Dziękujemy bardzo. Peter van Tienen.
Peter van Tienen. I'd like to invite more panelists, gentlemen from the Polish Banks Association, Mr. Balcerzak, then Mr. Jarosław Mastalerz, Managing Partner at M-Accelerator, Agnieszka Szopa-Maziukiewicz, Managing Director of BIG SA, Felix Szyszkowiak, Deputy President, Vice President of the Board of BZWBK. So that's, these are all our panelists, and you can ask questions, you can participate in the discussion. Once in a while, I'm looking out to the room, whether or not someone would like to take the floor or say something. Indeed, the vision presented by our guest is maybe scary, For example, when we speak about how easy it is to access technologies that are used to attack us, customers, you, representatives of institutions. Of course, each attack on a customer is, in a way, indirectly related with the institution. So, what is the scale of risk? Mr. Mastalerz, what do you think? Did anyone try to fraud you recently? Do you mean, was there somebody trying to... well, did anybody try to steal your data by phishing or something else? No, it didn't happen to me personally, but of course I had an opportunity to see the scale of this phenomenon and how inventive hackers and other fraudsters are. As leading internet bank, we are of course a training ground for many people of this kind. So I'm not saying I admire criminals, but we are surprised by this creativity. Was there anything in particular surprising? Well, of course, we can talk about security a lot. We can talk about what banks do in terms of security. When I look at the last 10 years evolution of what banks have done, banks now are those forts that nobody is able to come in. There are DDoS attacks. Nobody is trying to get into banks. They are more trying to get into devices. Well, it's always directed towards clients. As there will be people. There'll be people calling a lady saying, "I will block your account if you, unless you give me your account and your login, your login and your password." Spyware, malware would be installed, and there would be bots checking whether or not you log onto your account. Then it would show the screenshot to the criminal somewhere in China, India, or Russia. So every week we get new attack vectors. All of them are creative because they need to surprise us. How do you estimate the effectiveness of those attempts? The Tesco's, for example, that was a famous example. Fortunately, we didn't experience anything on this scale. Well, we didn't have that for a very simple reason, namely we are a country with relatively less money with an exotic currency, and that would be an argument against joining Eurozone, right? Yeah, well, dollar would be the favorite currency of criminals. Well, what I would like to say is that it's one thing to steal the money from the account, and it's a completely different challenge to actually get the money in your hand. An anecdote would be that there was an attack when a lot of banks were attacked, a lot of money was stolen from people's attacks. And the biggest logistic operation was not to steal the money from the banks, but to retrieve the money. And very big criminal organizations had to organize thousands of people to which the money was sent. Then all the money at a specified time would go to ATMs to retrieve the money from Brazil to Korea. And then somebody had to collect the money from those mules, because once they had the cash, you had to make sure that they would return the money. So apart from technology, you're talking about organizing huge criminal group where you're talking about tens of thousands of people. But what about the scale of these attempts? Is it growing or is the same in term when you measure it in the number of attacked customers? Well, nobody keeps this this kind of statistics because banks are not really eager to share this data. It is significant, like Peter would said before. Well, he showed a burglar. So I'd like to ask you, if somebody's if somebody robbed your flat, how much money they would steal from you? From my flat, people wouldn't be able to steal a lot of money from me. I don't keep money at home. I don't have the TV is cumbersome to get out. I was robbed twice, and the biggest problem was that you have to replace the locks. They would damage some property. Okay, I also don't have any valuables at my home. While in fact on your account you have quite a lot of zeros. Yeah, I wish somebody stole my loan mortgage in Swiss francs. I would like to say that yes, I am holder of a mortgage loan in Swiss francs. So, Mr. Balcerzak, how does it look? Well, the number of attacks declined, but the attacks now are much more targeted, and the quality of attacks is improving. Until recently, we saw phishing websites with, some strange mistakes. There were some Chinese characters in a Polish text. Right now, when you go to a phishing website, it looks like a really professional website. And now, if you look at the number of cases that we detect, this number grows as well. What's very important is that we see growth, at least in our bank, in terms of fraud. I think in majority of banks, fraud is going up. But also the number of transactions is going up, so in percentage terms, proportionally, it's not that bad. Right, so we have more and more business, and that's why you get a lot of fraud. Well, people do more transactions, certainly, but we talked about fraud. It's not always the same. Yeah, okay.
But you're also putting into this category cases related to cyber security. And what about cyber attacks that are addressed at the money of our customer? So these are the money of the customer, but are those attacks targeted at the customer or the bank? It doesn't matter on the part of the customer. Has anyone tried to attack a bank in Poland in the recent years? Yes, of course, and there were numerous attacks. There have been numerous attacks, and they are registered almost every day. Every day? Yes, but if we are talking about successful attacks, then I would say that there were only a few. Recently, there was a case last year, on the turn of this year, that is in January, the website of the Polish Financial Supervision Authority was used, and it was hacked. Malware was installed there, and a few banks were infected. This was a new threat, a new malware which was written from scratch, so it was very hard to detect, and only after some time we were able to identify it. So I think that there will be more and more such attacks. But we must say that banks as professional institutions spend a lot of money to so that this money is deposited, because in the end of the day, the worst scenario that can reach the bank and can make a lot of banks collapse is to destroy their image. And now I would like to ask Ms. Mazurkiewicz, what would you like to say about the scale of this problem? Well, we already said that the infrastructure of banks is very well secured. Banks spend millions to secure themselves, and even tens of millions of zloty to secure themselves. And when we take a look at the current situation, then we should say that more than 50% of the attacks are addressed and targeted at the end user, and also at the identity theft. The methods that are used are not using malware, but they use socio-technical methods and manipulation. Hackers manipulate ourselves so that we give them our data ready. This is the problem. I will give you a simple example, which is very often observed nowadays. For example, identity is stolen very often in the following manner. The technique is used, which is very popular, that is pretending to be an acquaintance of a given person. Peter showed us that we have 26 online accounts and only 5 passwords, or 26 million. No, sorry, 26 accounts as one user. We have 26 different accounts, for example, Facebook, Allegro, internet banking, and so on, and only 5 passwords. It is interesting who of you have a different password to every social media. Or somebody admitted to have a different password, but they have 2 accounts or 5? 50? No, I won't believe it. So it is easy to steal our Facebook accounts, and when we pretend to be an acquaintance of ourselves. We trust such people, and we get a simple email. Maciek, please buy me this headset at Allegro. This is the link. I will give you back the money tomorrow. And very often we trust such a person because we think this is our friend. We click on that link, and this link doesn't get us any further. It doesn't get us to Allegro, but it gets us to a false website of payment intermediary, which is not that easy to identify, as President Szyszkowiak said, because later we click on the internet banking option, which is also false. We give all our credentials, our login, our password, and actually the hacker has already our data to access our internet banking, and there he can do anything. And now, thinking about text message passwords, we don't read the passwords that we don't read the communication, the message that is sent to us together with this password. We just look at the number, and actually we accept, for example, defining a predefined recipient of a transfer. And this is an open road to steal our money. Peter van Dienen nodded his head, and I will ask you if you could please give some new examples of new ideas that the hackers use nowadays.
Działa. It's okay.
It's on. So yeah, so I very much agree with what Agnieszka just said, and I think there's it's also a responsibility for us as consumers, which I don't think every one of us takes seriously enough. And what we see time after time is that the human link in the end is still the weakest link in the whole chain, which is also the hardest thing to change. And another question that I had on my mind, which would be really interesting, because the gentleman in the middle made a really good point earlier, when he said that we don't really know the numbers on the number of attacks, etc., because banks, and not only banks, in every vertical market, no one actually wants to share those numbers and is afraid of brand image and all these kind of things. So my question also to banks here in the panel or maybe in the room would be, do you think that will happen one day, and do you think it should happen, that banks are, let's say, obliged to come out with those numbers if they are under attack? And what do you think will happen if that becomes mandatory one day?
You are saying it's not going to happen? Well, we must bear in mind one thing. As you said, more than 90% of attacks result in losing the keys. Maybe the client loses those keys, maybe he gives them away, or maybe he uses them on his own. Well, when we switch offline, well, for example, somebody wants to rob us, want to break in our house, so somebody has to open the door for the burglar to come in. Well, these attacks are not addressed, are not targeted at the bank. It is targeted at consumers. The statistics would be available if consumers reported this to the police. But it isn't reported to the police, or very often the police cannot search for these criminals because they are not easy to identify in darknet. We will not have this data. But what is important in these attacks is this. If we've got PSD2 regulation also within the scope of bank's responsibility. Now, the bank has 24 hours when I report that my account was cleared. The bank sees it because somebody logged in by login and password and made a transaction, and the bank has to make a decision. The bank may decide that I did it myself, and then the bank will not refund such a client. And if the client doesn't do it himself, then the bank will not refund such a client. But what if the client wants to deceive us? So what will you do with it as a sector? I think it is a good question. Every one of us in the sector will have to answer this question for himself or herself. I know that it is a good question. I won't be modest, but I want to get an answer. I think that we are all thinking how to approach it, because it is not a solution to treat all the clients as frauds. We don't want to treat our customers as thieves, but we also don't want to get open to all the frauds. So maybe if a client has financial problems, then maybe they will just they will just want to use the fraud. Well, banks are not technically ready to verify if the computer of the consumer was attacked, or if this is a situation where the client wants to deceive the bank. I think that what is important here is to extend this security on the end user. Because now we are talking about login, identifier and password. I think that we need additional methods of verification. But what about customer experience? When we have more verifying methods, then the customer experience will be worse. Well, these methods don't have to be very complicated for the end user, because usually when we take a look at such systems as identifying devices, where a lot of parameters of the device is collected, and this is done through internet banking without installing anything on the client's computer. So, for example, we get a message that you started to use your smartphone differently, so it means that somebody else has it now, for example. But also, for example, you started making transactions from a totally different device. So those additional profiles of the user basing on the behavior and on the device, I think they are necessary to build the security, because a simple login and password are not enough. We'll come back to it later. I would like to ask Mr. Szyszkowiak about this directive, this related to payments, what it will bring in the context of security. I will start with customers. If actually customers want to have it, make it easy when it comes to smaller amounts, but when they want to make huge payments, they want to be safe. Sometimes we cut off our customers if we see that there is some irregularity, and we can hear that customers thank us. Actually, we hear thank you from the customers, and it used to look differently some years ago. So if you deal with large amounts, then customers don't mind if it's inconvenient. Yes, they don't mind it. When it comes to the directive, unfortunately, I have a negative opinion on this directive. When it comes to fraud, if a customer wants to use this directive, to abuse this directive to a broader extent, then I think it would be a great field for all the criminals. Because for years we have been educating our clients, and they know that if we change anything to our service, to our platform, then they will know it. They know that they shouldn't give their password to anyone, and so on and so forth. And in a minute, this bubble will burst, because we will have thousands of providers, so-called third-party providers. They will have different websites and so on. So I think it will be a perfect field for cyber crime. I absolutely agree with you. Today, the law doesn't allow such practices. The Polish Financial Supervision Authority indicates that in its recommendations, when it comes to suits that are filed by customers because they lost their funds, then usually banks as professional institutions are the losers already today, because they are also expected to take care about customers, but very often customers themselves make decisions to give their credentials to other people. Sometimes they do it subconsciously, and the decision whether the customer did it on purpose or not is dependent on whether he or she intended to do it. When it comes to securing our architecture and thinking for the client, we'll have its limit. And on the other hand, we will have to really thoroughly educate our clients, because I agree that each and every service, banking service that is offered remotely, generates a kind of risk. The bank covers this risk, validates it, but unfortunately, we are not always responsible for what is happening on the part of the client. I will give you an example. Two banks were merging, and criminals invented a great vehicle because they encouraged the customers to make a test transfer. They said to customers that they told the customers that the bank wants them to make a test transfer, and thanks to that, the customer will check the security of such accounts. And customers were deceived. They gave their credentials, they made these transfers. I would like to say that, of course, banks cannot be held responsible for the fact that I lost the key to my account in an easy way because I don't know how the bank should do it. But on the other hand, the bank is responsible for the education, but also for selecting and promoting products that increase security of my account. Today you are all consumers. How can you secure your identity? You can buy antivirus program and software, but it is not much. And then the customer has his own reason. But the reason of the customer is not all, because we have technology that supports the software. What we lack today is the software that the customer can buy, can install on his or her device, and this software will increase the security of my identity. And today the bank will say, okay, so you lost the identity and we will refund, we'll give you back your funds. But on the other hand, the bank may also make the other decision that they won't refund me in any way. But we as consumers don't have access to such software. So what can we do? We can install antivirus and we can remember not to give our credentials to anyone. I would like to ask Peter Vantinen something. Peter Vantinen from Experian. There is a thesis that the bank is not to secure your keys to your account. Is it okay? Please switch to channel 2. Can you hear me? Can you hear the interpreter? Can you hear the interpreter? There is a thesis that the bank is not responsible for securing the keys to the flat or the keys to the account in this case of the customer. But can banks do anything, or are they doing anything, so that the customer is more secure on his own part? So not to protect the bank system, but to make the customer behave in a secure and safe way, or he has or his computer or smartphone is better protected?
I think that banks and consumers, and I think pretty much everyone, is motivated by money. So what we, like we all are. So what we see happening is in countries where the banks are actually responsible, or they need to pay whenever some money is stolen out of an account of a consumer. In those countries, banks actually provide more service and help and support and advice to help those consumers protect their bank accounts. And in countries where the banks are not reliable for if any money has been stolen from consumers, banks do actually less. So it depends on which country you're looking at. In general, I would agree with the theory that you're responsible yourself as a consumer to protect yourself. I think that what Agnieszka said earlier is absolutely correct, that the old password and login is going to disappear, or at least it's not going to be enough anymore. So there's going to be new ways of protecting ourselves. Yeah, so that's it depends on which country. I believe that in Poland, banks are only partially responsible, to liable if money has been stolen.
Should be more.
Is that correct?
And should be more responsible.
Yeah, in my view, that's more of a personal view, because I see so many different structures in so many different countries. And I think it could be a little bit more than it is now. And I will be curious to see what the rest thinks of that as well.
No właśnie, jak jest z tą odpowiedzialnością? Znaczy,
Right, so what about there's no liability for the keys, but maybe the bank could do more to raise the security for customers. Well, banks are doing something more. Education? Well, I don't believe in education. Well, I do believe in education as such per se, but two Nobel Prizes were granted to people for studying lack of rationality in their economic behaviors. So, well, people are hardly ever rational in their economic behavior. So, I believe the same goes for security. So we educate, but maybe we should find some sort of trick to convince or to force people in a secure way. No. People are rational about, say, security of their money. There are very few people who are light-minded about their money. Yes, but how many people break the speed limit? Are they rational, or are they light-minded? Majority of them, or well, you should ask. We should ask psychologists or policemen. Well, people are trying to keep their money safe. Well, there is minority who respond to phishing, who fall victim to phishing, but still quite a lot. It's not zero. And frankly speaking, I'm afraid of shifting responsibility to the bank, to the state, or an institution, because it's a vicious circle. Because if somebody is, well, people should be thinking what they are doing with their lives. So people shouldn't be reckless. We are doing more, even if the customer is cheated of his or her money. He shifts the blame to the bank. Okay, Director, now floor is yours. It's in the interest of banks to do something, because ultimately it is the bank who has the problem. Education is not enough. Yes, education does work. We did compare various banks. So education does work, but we can't stop there. We should do more. It seems that additional customer protection, not only login and password, but also identification of the device and the building of a profile, adding this passive biometrics, so checking how the customer, how quickly he types, how he uses his mouse. Adding all this kind of data is very important, because login and passwords plus the behavioral profile and the device, all this is much harder to break. So if the user is tired, he types more slowly, he'll just get the text message asking, is it really you? So BIC sees this need, and we've implemented a device identification system to strengthen user authentication. And the cases we've discussed from Allegro, so these systems will detect this kind of behavior because of a different time zone, different keyboard. coming back to buying security from outside, Mr. Mastalerz, what are we talking about? Well, if we are talking about passive biometrics, we are talking about solutions that come outside of the banking sector, because banking sector will not create passive biometric technology. So there is very little supply of products to enable us to protect our identity. If you look at what can you buy to protect your flat? There's a whole range of locks, of blinds protecting the windows. You can insure your flat. Today, if you want to protect your identity, apart from education, tips like don't divulge your passwords to strangers, all of that is present. So apart from this, the only thing you can do is to have an up-to-date antivirus program. So what kind of support can you get apart from this? We need an industry of consumer products sponsored by banks or paid for by customers, because of course banks pay for it from customers' money. But anyway, we need a group of products created. It's not just about just one product. It's a range of products that will enable you to protect your identity better. So we protect our flats, spending a lot of money protecting our flats. 50-60 zlotys spent per month, and they spend nearly zero on protecting the computers and telephones. And it's not only about account access. Peter, you...
Interesting point, and it reminds me of maybe some of you have seen it. We did a press release a couple of days ago. We have a service which is currently only active in the US, which is only for consumers, or especially for consumers, and it's basically a search of your own data on the dark web. So you type in your own email address or whatever, all the information you have about yourself, and the service is going to search on the dark web if your available is being sold out there. If so, you can change it. So this is directly for consumers to take matters into their own hand, responsibility into their own hand. And we're now launching this service also in Europe. I don't have the exact roadmap in my head, but I'm sure Poland will be on there as well. So this plays right into that example.
Ciekawy przykład. A teraz jeszcze króciutko wewnątrzsektorowej, może międzysektorowej.
Now about intersectoral data exchange, Mr. Balcerzak, how can we benefit from it? Well, I have the pleasure of working in the cyber security center, that is an integrator for the banking sector in this area. And then close cooperation, sharing experiences, gathering information from various sources, external and internal, provides real benefits already now. If we are in a situation where bank experts from the very different banks come together and discuss and create some content, we get a lot of benefits from that. Do everybody share this information in a solidary way? Because we can imagine somebody who invested a lot of money in his stuff. He might not be willing to share the information with some small institution. Well, banking sector for many years has created several rules to go by. One of them is that in cybersecurity there is no competition. Today it's a problem of some other bank today, tomorrow it may be my problem. Unless I cooperate with other banks, I open the door to fraudsters, to criminals. And then we are catching up. In this way, we are catching up with the criminals. An attack on a smaller bank also translates to security of other banks. Is there a real-time information flow, like hotline? When there is an attack on one bank, others know about it, like, alarm ringing in the CEO's office? Well, when we talk about operation, we don't need an alarm ringing at the CEO's office for measures to be taken, because those competent employers, staff, are accompanied by appropriate procedures and technologies. So the main factor that determines efficiency in fighting cyber criminals is time. So if we have tested partners, we are more liable to handle an event. Of course, our competence ends at certain point. Enforcement authorities come in at some point. Telecoms come in at certain point. For example, when Pentia ransomware, during ransom malware Pentia happened, everybody was involved, including enforcement authorities, and with being aware of how important our actions are for the public, we didn't think who will pay for it. We just did what we were supposed to do. Also, when we are talking about incidents, about data integrity, banks say that it is important to inform supervisory authorities like the Financial Supervision Authority or the Personal Data Protection Authority. Based on our experience, we will develop practices to mitigate the risks. And the guys on the other side are trying to get ahead of us. So who are they? Who are they? Who are they? Who are the bad characters? Who are the villains? Well, we talked before that the hacker profile is changing. Today, in fact, the biggest threat comes not from the young people sitting, in their bathrooms or some. Although in the presentation we've heard that there is, somebody sitting upstairs. Well, there was this movie about this guy who launched the rockets from Okay, so there are those geniuses who can do this or that, but these are individual cases. Experts say that hackers are not really lonely geniuses. A couple of years ago, the United States government included in its warfare doctrine cyber war. So formally, in West Point and probably other universities, several professional hackers are being trained. The same happens in Israel, Russia, China, as well as other countries, India or North Korea. In 15-20 years, these people will be retired from the army. So what do SAS, former SAS soldiers do? They get employment from the bad guys and from the good guys. So those hackers military hackers will get retired, they will get some sort of employment, and they will be much more dangerous than the guys in sweaters, in jumpers. Thank you, panelists. Thank you very much for your discussion. Now I will ask Mr. Mariusz Cholewa to provide a summary of what happened today. Right, not to end on this pessimistic note, is there a way to protect yourself against the risk? Let me advertise our service. We have an alert service. If there is anybody trying to access our data in BIC, you get a text message. You are being checked by this or that institution. So once you get this message, you know who's doing it, and if there's somebody who's unauthorized, we can react. We can also add credit fleets. So, for example, the customer may say that he doesn't want any credit. So we will launch it to banks this year already, and in order for it to be effective, we need to act together. I'm not sure if you remember the movie Gladiator. Russell Crowe enters this arena with a group of gladiators. They are spreading around and somewhere in the corners, and he says, whatever comes from behind this gate, we must stick together. And then thanks to them sticking together, they won. So this is actually true about anti-fraud, about security. If the banking sector keeps together, sticks together, we will win, we'll be secure. If we try to act individually, well, we will get some degree of security only. We launched this fraud platform, and then it was difficult to encourage the institutions, but then everybody will want to participate in the system. So that's how the market improves itself. This was just a comment on the last panel. Now I would like to thank you all for participating in this Congress. Thank you for sticking with us until the end. Sometimes the subjects we discussed were rather technical, which are very unique to only some people in your institutions. Thank you, panelists. Thank you. I'd like to thank all the speakers for your very interesting interventions. As I see it, and as I was sitting among you, it's all cool. The banks are doing well, the economy is doing well, the banks are able to manage risk, they've learned a lot, they are trying to use chatbots. It may be a risk because there might be a fintech out there who will be better than we. There are some challenges with PSD2 or MiFID, but this is not something we should be concerned. So it seems we are doing fine. Katarzyna Zajdel mentioned that always before a crisis, we think everything is fine. We are getting ready for a risk that has materialized before, and we protect ourselves against it, but we are not sure how to protect ourselves against risk that will materialize in the future. And the risk everybody's talking about is cyber threat, and we can only fight it when we stick together. And I wish that we do so. I would now like to invite all of you to an evening gala at 7:30. We are waiting for you. Not so many speeches. There will be a cake. So don't worry, we'll bore you to death. There will be some surprises. There will be a concert by Patrycja Małarkowska. We'll have a nice evening together. So.